Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, someone that I've been looking forward to having on this channel for years now. What are your keys to a longer, healthy, more vibrant life?
Well, first of all, Thomas, thank you so much for having me. And by the way, the viewer should know you made me extremely sweaty, almost going to barf on the Airdyne intervals. And while he is sitting here looking all shiny, this was a full setup. But I just wanted to lead with that. I love that you asked me, what are my keys to longevity? It should come as no surprise, muscle health is number one. Muscle health, we know that those with better muscle mass, more healthy muscle mass, have a greater survivability against nearly all cause of diseases. The stronger you are, the more healthy muscle mass you have, the more metabolically healthy you will be, the greater your mobility, the greater reservoir for anything. Your amino acids exist in skeletal muscle. So if you get injured or, God forbid, get a highly critical disease like cancer, skeletal muscle is going to be your survival mechanism. So that's number one.
After today's video, I encourage you to try colostrum. You've probably heard people talking about it before. There's a company called ARMRA. Now, colostrum is not a supplement. It's more of a whole food. Okay, so in this particular case, ARMRA is 100% bovine colostrum that comes after the calves have been fed. So it's perfectly sustainable, but also comes from grass-fed cows, but also from a co-op of dairy farmers. So it's ensuring really high quality product. Now, what's interesting about this colostrum from ARMRA is that it is not heat pasteurized like most colostrum, making it the most bioavailable colostrum that you can find. What that means is that when you heat pasteurize it, it breaks everything down, the 400 different living nutrients that are in colostrum. So with their cold chain technology, it makes it so that it's ensuring the delivery of this stuff. The way that I've been using colostrum is to help with recovery. There's some literature that suggests that it's up to a 50% increase in recovery. Obviously very good for the gut. It can help rebuild that gut barrier, but overall just gives you a good sense of feeling energized and feeling recovered. So that link down below is going to get you 15% off. It's tryarmra.com/Thomas. Again, that's tryarmra.com/Thomas. So check them out.
Now, if we unpack that a little bit, where do we draw the line between strength and muscle mass? When you're looking from a potential longevity standpoint, you've got strength sort of in one category, a lot of literature looks at grip strength and things like that. And then you've got actual mass.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Do you know why?
Why?
Because nearly everything in the literature is based on DEXA. So we have been looking not directly at skeletal muscle mass. The literature is built on a foundation of not directly measuring skeletal muscle mass. They will show lean body mass. Lean body mass is not skeletal muscle mass.
Not the same.
Skeletal muscle mass is part of lean body mass. So, and it's highly variable. Even in underwater weighing, we are still not directly measuring skeletal muscle mass. So what does that mean? That means a large body of evidence is built on a principle looking at a tissue without directly measuring the tissue. What does that mean? That means it's created a dichotomy where it looks like muscle mass doesn't matter. It looks like strength is the only thing that matters. But there is some literature by a man named William Evans, and he has come out with something called, him and a few of his colleagues have come out with something called D3 creatine. And this is a way of tagging skeletal muscle, because creatine is taken up by skeletal muscle, that you can actually begin to directly measure skeletal muscle mass. And what they found is that it is much more dangerous to have a loss of skeletal muscle than it is to have an increase in fat.
Wow.
But I think that these new discoveries and a new way of measuring is actually going to change the paradigm. The literature also shows from his work that muscle mass and strength are correlated. It's not this, you can just be strong without having mass. So this is going to come out and change. And I think we are just at the beginning of seeing this change.
Yeah, even when you think about it just totally logically, it's like the more muscle mass you have, that's a bigger metabolic sink. The more strength you have, the more protection you have from frailty and things like that. So it's sure, they go hand in hand, but if you really investigate it and even just think about it logically, it's there's benefits in different categories, right? It's okay, if you have a sink that is literally your metabolic sink,
better be
and you
clean.
have a giant sink that can hold a lot of trash or sugar or whatever. But then you also have like a high pressure spray nozzle, right? That can help get it down the actual drain. It's like kind of the difference between having a big muscle with not a lot of strength or having a lot of strength with a really small muscle.
Right.
So I'd imagine there is sort of this sweet spot.
There is, and I think that that's a really great point, because in the literature and what a lot of the experts are saying is that muscle mass doesn't matter. The amount of mass doesn't matter, but that's not true. And especially in the aging population, we see that when they lose skeletal muscle mass, we see increase in blood glucose, we see a change in insulin resistance, so they become much more insulin resistant. We see an increase in triglycerides, often an increase in fatty acids. There's all these other metabolic changes. So while strength is important, arguably muscle mass is equally as important. And again, I believe that we're going to start to see changes in the literature when we incorporate directly looking at skeletal muscle.
If you had to give someone sort of a minimum effective dose for resistance training for sort of a combination of strength and muscle mass, what would you say? I would imagine it might change based on like the decade of life a little bit, but let's say maybe pre-age 50 and post-age 50.
Again, this is another really great question, and it depends on the training age. For you, I expect you to be fully trained into your 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? You're going to be doing that forever. But I would say for anybody starting 3 days a week of some kind of resistance training, whether it's 10 to 20 sets, and this is a pretty generic recommendation, but where I think it becomes important is that it's not just resistance training. And resistance training can cover a whole bunch of things. It could be body weight training, it could be yoga, Pilates. There's all different ways that people can do resistance training. I think being able to move weights in space is important.
Yeah.
Because it's important, for example, we both have little kids. What if I needed to be able to pick up both kids and sprint down the street? I want to be trained for that.
Yeah.
I want to be trained for real life. Being able to do a farmer carry or be able to do some kind of sprint interval with any kind of capacity. Being able to move in a translatable way is critical. And I recommend that no matter what age group, you start to learn that. And then as individuals age, they have to be able to fall well. I know that that sounds crazy, but I'm a trained geriatrician and falls are a major concern for me. They have to be able to spring back up or get back up.
Yeah, have you heard of the, I actually just learned about this, the T2Go, the timed up and go test?
Of course, I did that in geriatric training. So we did the timed up and go test. We did there's a walking speed test, there's a Romberg test, there's all kinds of things.
Speaking of physical frailty, and I'm not just saying this to toot my own repository of useless information in my brain, but my team and I, actually, I got to give them credit. My team found a really cool study on caffeine and frailty, and it was talking about timed up and go. And they actually showed that the more caffeine intake actually led to less physical frailty later in life, which I found was really interesting. Because if you look at it from an umbrella perspective, it's probably because they were more active because they had caffeine, right?
Yeah.
You can think about all these cardiometabolic benefits and CAMP and all this stuff, and you're like, well, you're just active. That's actually, I had never heard of the timed up and go test until then.
Yeah.
And I was like, what a practical test, just getting up out of a chair, walking. And people don't realize when you're 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, that matters.
So walking speed is a big deal, and that's something that we always test in clinic, is walking speed. And we know it's almost like another vital sign.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's pivot a little bit to the next one. Okay, so we've covered muscle mass, strength as a really important piece.
And that's probably the most critical. So I really do believe that skeletal muscle is the organ of longevity, and that we have spent decades focusing on obesity and all these diseases that ride along with it, when really we should be focusing on skeletal muscle mass. Not from a bro perspective, not from looking jacked and tan, but really from a muscle-centric medicine perspective.
And
that's
agree.
what is critical. Yeah.
All right, what would you say your second key to longevity is in Dr. Lyon's perspective?
In Dr. Lyon's world, I would say a really good babysitter. No, just kidding. That's true.
Yes.
So mitochondrial health is a big one, and within skeletal muscle is mitochondria. And how do we get more mitochondria? How do we get better, effective and efficient mitochondria? We can certainly do that through resistance exercise and high intensity interval training and endurance training. They all do various things to mitochondria. But why is mitochondria so important? Mitochondria, we know that it's the energy powerhouses of the cell. We've all heard that. But it's also the site of fatty acid oxidation. for individuals concerned about utilizing energy. That's very important. And what I love about mitochondrial health is I think we have opportunities to improve it, not just through exercise, but again, you and I were talking that we just love this compound called urolithin A, which I believe is going to be as big as the next fish oil.
And how exactly, like if we talk about the world of mitochondrial health, interlaced with longevity, possibly interplayed with urolithin A, like how does that all come into play? Like how can mitochondria potentially help us, not even from a lifespan perspective, but more so a health span perspective?
Well, feeling better, having more energy, just on a very basic level, having more energy. People believe that a lot of diseases of aging really come from mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yeah, there's a lot of metabolic theories to all kinds of different diseases, right? Like you look at every disease state, and you've got these DNA mutation theories, and you've got the and then you've got this whole other side that's very compelling. That is sort of the metabolic theory of aging and the metabolic theory. Yeah, it's wild.
It's certainly one of the hallmarks of aging is this decrease in mitochondrial function. But what is so fascinating is you can leverage skeletal muscle to influence mitochondrial health through exercise.
What, any specific kinds of exercise or like all of the above?
I would say all of the above, but each has a varying impact on different aspects of the mitochondria, whether it's improving mitochondrial volume or efficiency. And that's why training variability, I think, is really important.
So you think that being able to train through different capacities, different mediums,
affects mitochondria and affects muscle signaling differently.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think we're going to start to see more, there's data, you asked me about resistance training, and there's data that you can influence skeletal muscle in various ways. For example, if you are doing low load, so it's not that heavy, like older individuals might be doing less weight but more reps, that signal from a molecular signaling is a bit different than a heavier weight. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
sure.
that it may all be stimulating muscle protein synthesis, but there's other metabolic intracellular processes that are different and variable depending on the stimulus provided.
So when we look at how to sort of support the mitochondria, okay, it's so easy to say, it's the energy powerhouse of the cell, do these things for it. It's my understanding that, things like zone 2, zone 3 cardio might increase mitochondrial density, right? More mitochondria in a given space. But there's other aspects. There's things that happen to mitochondria that people don't realize, like that mitochondria has its own DNA, right? And it goes through its own form of autophagy called mitophagy. And there's these other aspects outside of just, do your endurance work to get more mitochondrial density. Can you elaborate a little bit more maybe on mitophagy and like urolithin A?
Yeah, I would love to. When we think about how we examine our overall health and the things that we can do, that can be challenging, right? Because we want to know that what we are putting in our body is giving us a result, right?
Yes.
Some of us like to eat pomegranate or walnut, and we think that just because something has a phytonutrient or, again, something within a food matrix, that we are actually getting those things. But that doesn't always happen. And urolithin A is a postbiotic. It comes from an ellagitannin, these group of compounds called ellagitannins, which are found in pomegranate or walnut, typically these plant sources. And 30 to 40% of individuals do not have the gut microbiome to generate urolithin A. I don't know, have you ever taken a test?
No, I haven't taken the test, but I'm aware that, that's very small.
So there's a small population that can do it. I haven't taken the test either, but urolithin A is a compound that has a lot of good data, randomized controlled trials in older adults, and we're seeing it in athletes to improve this concept of mitophagy, which is the regeneration and cleaning out of these old mitochondrial cells, which you have to do. You have to rebuild and repair so that things, are much more effective and efficient. One of the things that happens with aging is our ability to turn over mitochondria declines. And so a way to support it is through urolithin A. And I am very hard pressed to be impressed with data. I am very impressed with the urolithin A data.
Yeah, the bit that I've seen as well, it's very impressive.
Yes.
And it's sort of this theory that floats around there that has a lot of logic and reasoning to it, that, as you get older, and if let's pretend your mitochondria is becoming more dysfunctional, which more than likely it is as you get older, there's always a delicate balance of that mitochondria having, its daughter mitochondria and ultimately, basically the proliferation of mitochondria. But from a DNA standpoint, since mitochondria has its own DNA, if you have dysfunctional mitochondria, it's like a dysfunctional family having dysfunctional children, right? And like eventually you can end up down this rabbit hole. And there's literature to reinforce that, although it's, it's fairly mechanistic, but it makes a lot of sense. Then when you look at, in an aging population, enhancing mitochondrial health so that those mitochondria can still, let's just call it procreate. That's a very simple way of putting it, but it's not how it is. You're creating more mitochondria, right? Especially if you're putting the stops in place to create more mitochondria in the first place, exercise, resistance training, yada, yada. I'll put a link down below for Timeline, which you and I both talk about. Is pretty much the only patented way to get urolithin A.
Well, and also the evidence is so good for it. There's years and years of data. It starts with mechanistic data, move to animal models and then to humans. And when we start to see randomized controlled trials in humans that hold up, especially when it improves endurance and strength, that is something I pay attention to as a practicing physician.
If we look at, so for example, an endurance runner is going to be typically type 1 muscle fibers, which are going to have a lot more mitochondria per square inch, right? Now, you may or may not know this, but you are somewhat of a muscle expert here. Like if that person were to get larger muscles, but predominantly be a type 1 muscle fiber type, are they going to get more mitochondria than say a person that's predominantly type 2 that builds more muscle? Like that's where, and there may not be an answer to this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I know that answer, but definitely training, you can definitely increase mitochondria.
Yeah.
But the fiber question is interesting.
Yeah,
and I think that it's also, it's not binary. There's type 1, type 2A, type 2X. It's kind of, they're transition fibers, so.
Now we have potential hyperplasia where we can actually, which even 10 years ago in the bodybuilding world, I was like, that just didn't exist. That was untouchable. Like hyperplasia was like, hyperplasia, FYI, is, building new fibers versus just growing existing. And like that was like unattainable. It was just like, no, you were born, unless you have a myostatin deficiency, like you are born with what you're born with, and that's going to be it. But now we're seeing even in certain literature that hyperplasia may actually be a real thing. Which again, purely theoretical, but it almost seems as though, that could be the potential for specific muscle fiber types.
But I also think that you do bring up a point. As we age, muscle fiber changes and they lose a lot of those bulky fibers. As individuals get older, potentially get older and are untrained, they lose those bigger, bulkier muscle fibers and they transition to more of a type 1 fiber. And we often see individuals get skinnier and more sarcopenic. And that's a natural transition if an individual is not training.
Interesting.
And with that loss of skeletal muscle does come a loss of mitochondria.
Interesting.
And that is, it's just fascinating and probably preventable.
Well, it's preventable in the sense that I don't know if people realize, like once you put the mass on, it does not take much to keep it.
That's right.
Like stimulus is what I think Don Layman had said, it's like 75% of the equation, right?
Yes.
Is this the stimulus?
Yes, but how many people work out?
Unfortunately, not a lot.
50% of Americans.
That's actually more than I thought.
24% of Americans are meeting their recommended exercise requirements, which are abysmal.
So 50% of people are working out, but only 24% are meeting.
Correct.
So then what are the other 26% doing when they work out? Texting?
I have no idea. But isn't that fascinating? So this is why I talk about protein so much.
Yeah.
What do 100% of people do?
Eat.
They eat.
Yeah.
We have to get that right. Even if exercise is a much more potent stimulus to everything, 100% of people eat. We have to get that right, especially for an aging population.
That's such a good point, because it is, and it's something we're exposed to all the time, right?
That's
like
right.
We're always,
That's right.
like we're not all, well, we are, if you want to get literal, but we're not always exposed to artificial exercise, a gym or whatever. And it's a much tougher barrier for people to cross to understand the importance of exercise, because they may.
And we have proof of that. And that is, if you were to ask me which is a bigger stimulus, yes, the stimulus is training. The homeostatic mechanisms, the impetus and the input of what happens and the dynamics in the body, skeletal muscle is this endocrine organ that secretes myokines. There is just an array of things that happen. But again, if 50% of people aren't even doing that, that's not the place to start.
Yeah. Okay, so what's number 3 then?
A dietary protein intake, which is a little controversial because in the longevity space, you hear a lot of reducing dietary protein to maintain longevity. And the ultimate question is, are we talking about longevity or are we talking about quality of life? Yeah. I am a geriatrician by training, which means I was trained in taking care of individuals over the age of 65. So I did my fellowship in geriatrics and nutritional sciences, and I did my research in obesity medicine. So when it comes to longevity, you have to protect skeletal muscle at all costs. The data between dietary protein and skeletal muscle, that is very clear. Right now, our recommendation is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is 0.37 grams of dietary protein per 1 pound. That has not changed since 1968.
Okay, yeah.
So the question is it because we don't have any new science, or is it just...
I don't think there's any shortage of the science.
Exactly. And that is probably, I count it as number 3, but it's probably number 1 in protecting individuals as they age. And the data shows that double the RDA has a much better effect on aging muscle. And so that's at least, you're looking at 1.6 grams per kg.
It's so wild that it's even like kind of controversial to talk about protein, because whether you're plant-based or animal-based or
you need more
omnivorous,
protein. Yes.
It's, I always say, and I said this literally filming some videos yesterday, it's like, if I had the choice of living to 90 years old and like being healthy and active all the way up until the day I die, or living to be 120, but having my kids sort of have to wipe my like for the last 20 years of my life, like I'm going to live to 90.
But also, where is the evidence that in humans, a protein restrictive diet extends life?
Yeah, there's nothing.
Is it a calorie restriction that we're talking about? But I'd also like to highlight why people kind of harp on this. And they do it because of this mechanistic target of rapamycin. So they've taken one mechanism, one complex, a protein kinase complex. So mechanistic target of rapamycin is this growth promoter, right? It's in all cells. It's in the brain, it's in the liver, it's in the pancreas. It is stimulated by different inputs in different tissues. For example, in the pancreas, mTOR may be stimulated more by insulin. In the liver, it might be more sensitive to insulin. Skeletal muscle is exquisitely sensitive to proteins. Skeletal muscle is a protein sensing organ. It senses the quality of the diet. So skeletal muscle is exquisitely sensitive to this essential amino acid called leucine, which I know that you've spoken about. And that stimulates mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, which, by the way, also resistance training does too. And this cascade happens where through, certain initiation factors and, the end result we hope is muscle protein synthesis, which is this incorporation of amino acids. People are saying that because amino acids stimulate mTOR in skeletal muscle, somehow that's related to cancer and longevity.
I mean, I could see how they could make that leap.
Then why wouldn't you worry about excess calories and insulin?
Yeah.
Why would it be dietary protein?
Yeah, exactly.
So the question is, how does that make any sense? If we know that an individual's survivability, if you look at the CDC, the top 10 things that someone are going to die of is what? Is it going to be heart disease, Alzheimer's? What's number 2? Like you name it, accidental falls. Obviously someone doesn't fall off a cliff, or accidental injury, kidney disease, diabetes. All of these are diseases related to metabolic health, directly related to skeletal muscle.
Yeah.
If you reduce dietary protein, how are you going to maintain the health of skeletal muscle?
Well, not to mention that mTOR is still required for healthy cell regeneration in those organs too.
That's right.
And I mean, if you were to follow that theory that, mTOR equals bad, then even cardiovascular exercise would be bad.
Right.
Because people think that mTOR is just this like pure on-off switch. I mean, there's various, there's mTOR 1C, there's global mTOR, there's all kinds of different, like I might have some mTOR in my pinky toe right at this moment, even though, I'm not eating, right? It blows my mind that we can take it's a perfect example of like majoring in the minors, right? We take one little mechanistic piece And we become so fixated on it that we let that overshadow or change the lens in which we look at the entire spectrum of life.
Yeah, and it quite frankly doesn't make any sense, especially from what we know about aging. And we know how important skeletal muscle mass is. And then to layer it on another, to think about it from another lens is that we also haven't been directly measuring skeletal muscle mass.
Fair point.
So if we put all these things together, then we have to take a step back and look at it from a global perspective. If you care about longevity, you have to care about skeletal muscle. There are two main ways to care about skeletal muscle from a big perspective. This is resistance training and dietary protein. The evidence is clear. 0.8 grams per kg is the minimum to prevent deficiencies. And that is even too low. These nitrogen balance studies, and we don't even need to go into the fact that leucine will never be a limiting amino acid because it won't show up as a limiting amino acid in the blood just because the body maintains a certain level. Mm-hmm. So these recommendations are really misleading for people when we think about longevity.
Well, so we've tackled 3 and they obviously are categorized in the same bucket. So clearly we know where, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon has her stock as far as longevity. But if we talk about maybe a couple more that maybe support protein or support exercise or kind of work in that category, are there any sort of, I would even call them fringe things that you might put in your longevity bucket?
Nobody's gonna like this answer.
Good.
No one is gonna like this answer. And I'm sorry, and it's gonna be a moment of Debbie Downer, and then we can move on to number 5, acceptance. What I see as someone who's taking care of people at the end of life is that the culture in the US does not accept death. And we spend a lot of time avoiding the conversation of an inevitable endpoint, that nobody gets out of here alive. And that when we recognize that life is precious and it is short, then we become very much in the moment and peripheral things matter a lot less. When you learn how to live well, you learn how to die well.
That's a good way to put it.
And I know that nobody wants to hear about that, but it is an inevitable truth. And when we stop pushing off this idea of death, a lot of the warriors that I treat, they face death routinely and they acknowledge it as something that they are prepared for. And if we just step into a little bit more preparation and acceptance and awareness of it, I think it may change our focus on longevity.
You and I both work with a lot of the similar operators.
Which is one reason this is one of the reasons I absolutely adore you. I didn't, when we first met, I had no idea, and it all made a lot of sense.
Well, and I guess the reason I mentioned that is I noticed that these operators and especially in the tier 1 special forces groups, they are facing death all the time, right? They also, at least from my experience, seem to have some of the richest family relationships that I've ever seen.
Yes.
They have the richest relationships with their close friends and their family. And I think it's because they've faced that idea of death and they know it. And when they come home, they're the most present people.
Yes.
I know 5 or 6 of them that have become very, very, very close friends, and they motivate me to be a better husband, a better father, and to be present. And they have the ability to compartmentalize, when they need to go do their thing. But when they come back, they are focused on living, and they don't go do insane things like I need to live.
Running with buffaloes.
Yes. We'll talk about that story later. But the point is when you actually have that acceptance, it changes things. And I feel like I don't know how people can just go about accepting death other than just, being aware of it and virtually accepting it. But it's a good thought to have, and it's something to remind ourselves of every day that, like you said, no one gets out of here alive.
Yes. And so that is something that I think really helps with longevity. Not directly, but it makes you reframe how you spend your time, which is really important.
Well, I think indirectly it does impact because say what you want about the nuances of the blue zones, which may or may not be complete BS, but either way, there are common denominators that I do think are important, and that is obviously their activity, their sunlight, and their relationships, right?
Yeah.
So whether or not you agree with the archive issues with the blue zones and longevity, because there's a lot of aspects I don't agree with that I don't think line up. But the aspects that definitely I think we could all learn from are like how much they value relationships, and those regions do tend to appreciate like time in the present. They don't work themselves to death, and those things are so important. So indirectly, it does impact longevity.
Yeah. Yes. And then the other thing I think that is underappreciated is early cancer detection. Yeah. And that has saved a lot of lives that I've seen. And there's ways in which you can do it that used to be research that are they are no longer in research, like it's something called a GRAIL test or a Gallery test, where they screen for over 60 different types of cancers. They look for DNA methylation markers. I think that is really, really valuable. Staying up to date on a colonoscopy and an endoscopy. These things are, I know it's crazy, but a lot of people push it off. A lot of people push that off. Mammogram, pap smear, all of these things that are very easy to do should be done. They should be done. Thyroid ultrasound, just basic things, because when you catch cancer early, you can treat it.
Okay, so we're gonna round the corner out of the more kind of dark side of Dr. Gabrielle Lyon.
The dark side of accepting death and cancer screening to my fifth and final, most important longevity perspective, and that is gastrointestinal health. And by the way, I was recently talking about this. There was a special operations conference for their dietitians. So Deb Groove's dietitians, and it is gut health. And gut health interfaces with muscle health, it interfaces with brain health, it interfaces with everything. We treat gastrointestinal issues in my clinical practice all the time. All the time. You can bleep that out. And it is so misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. So you've heard of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth?
Of course, yeah.
If you got food poisoning, and then if you get food poisoning and you get one of 3 bugs, and for some reason you don't clear it, which most people don't, you are going to get small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It is the same as having H. pylori and getting an ulcer. Food poisoning, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And there's ways that you can test it. You can look at antiviculin. Viculin is, so your body, what happens is when you get food poisoning, whether it's E. coli, Salmonella, or Campylobacter, there's a few, the body builds antibodies to itself, to viculin. And viculin is kind of these motor units that help with contractility in the gut. You can test for antiviculin antibodies. So essentially, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is an autoimmune condition. And it can be treated. If you catch it early, you can treat it very easily with Xifaxan. I mean, I tend not to use natural treatments. I don't think that they're as effective. But yes, so that is kind of mind-blowing, and it just hasn't caught up in the mainstream yet.
Yeah.
But
I'm listening because I told you I got
food poisoning.
I got food poisoning last weekend from scallops.
So we should test your antiviculin antibody.
All right, let's do it.
And CDT8. So there are antibodies that this can ultimately become an autoimmune condition.
Wow. So obviously I can see the link with autoimmune conditions and longevity, but is there a broader spectrum at how the gut biome, not even necessarily the gut biome, but gut
absorption
health?
For nutrients.
Okay.
So it's not just what you eat, it's what you absorb, it's what you get. And if you destroy your intestinal lining, this becomes a problem.
That's wild.
Yeah. So food poisoning causes SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which then becomes an autoimmune condition.
So does it become an autoimmune condition just because you're continually forming antibodies and that just kind of becomes a runaway train?
Yep. So you got to treat it early. You got to catch it and you got to treat it early.
Not to mention probably the disruption of the protein junctions in your gut and lipopolysaccharides from then on out. Kind of this inflammatory spiral that happens.
Yes. And then the other thing, oh man, people are not going to like this. Do not kiss your dogs on the face. If your dog had Giardia, and again, I treat this in my clinic because of the population that we serve. Not that everyone has dogs, but if you go to obscure places, which everyone, people travel to Asia, Africa, any of these places. Also, domestic animals are a vector. If they have something like Giardia, many times the human can get it.
It makes sense from a bacterial perspective, right? Because in that world, like a lot of things are transmissible.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just like if you were to go out and, touch dog feces in the backyard, and then, like it could happen, right?
But oftentimes that people will struggle with gastrointestinal health. And the other thing is one partner can be a silent carrier and they just are not symptomatic. And you can get it from toilet seats, you can get it from sheets. Again, it's not like a sexually transmitted bacteria or protozoan or, anything, or parasite or helminth, but you can still get it. So if one person in the house gets it, everyone should be tested.
Wow.
And by the way, the traditional testing, and this is a real sticking point for us in the practice, is everybody uses this PCR testing, DNA PCR testing. And it is at least a 50% false negative. At least 50%.
So then what route do you go?
You have to get infectious disease involved.
Okay.
Old school infectious disease doctors, which there are not a ton, because a lot of them left practice during the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, we have found liver fluke, schistosomiasis. We have found Entamoeba histolytica. We have found more worms that I could ever tell you. Flukes, liver flukes, all of and every single DNA test or PCR test that you see comes back negative.
Especially as like machine learning is getting involved with this stuff too, because then it's like if the PCR tests don't detect these things,
they almost never do.
They
almost never do.
It's essentially, I mean, not to sound cryptic, but it's where AI can really go wrong. Like the machine learning is just like, we're just going to learn based on what the data that we get.
Yes.
But if the data is incorrect,
so we presented these cases. We presented these cases to these dietitians that are interfacing with special operators. And again, you don't have to be a dietitian interfacing with special operators. You could be a health coach and you could be looking at this. You could be a dietitian looking at this. Things that you will see elevated levels of eosinophils above 3. Yeah. You will see low levels of ferritin, low levels of iron that you cannot figure out when no one is, the person is not bleeding. And then gastrointestinal issues where they've been tested and quote treated for everything.
Wow.
That is absolutely an underlying pathogen that has just not been found yet.
This is legitimately like super interesting to me. That's definitely not one that I would have expected you to say.
We do it all the time in our practice. And after they've been everywhere else, they've been to Mayo Clinic, they've been to all these places.
Can people, I'll put a link down to, all your stuff down below. So if people are interested in that, can they contact you or your practice?
They can contact the practice. Absolutely.
I'm going to actually do that myself too. So. Well, Dr. Lyon, where else can everyone find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. My website, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. I have a new book.
Heck yeah.
Forever Strong. And you can get that wherever books are sold and on my website, on Amazon. I have a great podcast, which you will be on. And where else? All the places. Yeah. Great newsletter.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. And thank you so much, Dr. Lyon.